Today we are reviewing the second film adaptation of the 1982 novel The Color Purple. But this time around is not only based on the book, but it's also based on the musical that came out back in 2005. So the question is this new film adaptation any good, and is it worth seeing in theaters this holiday season? We'll be discussing that and much more in today's review. What's going on, movie fans, and welcome back to my channel. Before I get into my review of the 2023 version of The Color Purple, I want to know your thoughts in the comments below. Number one, have you read the book that this is based upon? Have you seen the musical? What are your thoughts on the 1985 version of the story? But more importantly, once you've seen this version of the movie, what worked, what didn't work? Let's have those conversations in the comments below. So I have a very interesting relationship with the 1985 version of this film because as a kid in the 90s, it was always on TV. I grew up in a house full of women. We owned the VHS version of this film, and I'll be honest, it's not a movie I was a fan of because it made me sad. It was very traumatizing, but as I got older, I really came to appreciate the themes and the messages throughout the movie and really love the representation of the strength of the black women, and it was a very important story to tell during that time, and it does have a long-lasting effect, and again, I really came to grow to appreciate it. So I haven't read the book. I've only seen the 1985 version of this film multiple times, and I haven't seen the musical. So when I heard they were making this story into a musical, again, knowing it was based on a musical, I said to myself, this sounds like a cash grab, but also it's not going to be nearly as good or as powerful or as serious as the film version that I grew up on. So with all that being said, let's talk about the movie, talking about things that worked for me, starting off with the artist and director Blitz Bazawule, who puts his artistic direction and style onto this movie in a very unique and creative fashion. There is a rhythm and flow to his approach to this very heartbreaking story. There are moments where you're going to find yourself being very emotional about what's going on screen, and then moments later you find yourself smiling and having fun with the upbeat musical numbers, as he really highlights the joyful moments and brings the story to life in a way that feels vibrant and very much alive. Now, pairing his style with the incredible work from the production departments, you can feel the energy and enthusiasm from the camera work matched with the lively choreographed performances. Now, speaking of the performances and the musical element of this film, I found most of it to be quite stunning, and there are some sequences that will have you in amazement while watching this film because you can feel the passion that was put into this movie. You really feel the influences of jazz and R&B, and especially the gospel elements, which makes you feel welcoming and uplifting. So collectively, his direction, the music, the production all comes together, and it truly captures the essence of the original story, and it mixes the tone in a very different way, and it handles this very serious subject matter in a way that you can appreciate, again, the seriousness of what's going on the screen, but also the joy that comes within this narrative. So that all worked for me, as well as not being a musical expert per se. I will have to admit that there were some really great songs in this movie for me. Not all of the music work, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but the two standout moments for me from the musical aspects. There's a song by Sophia, who's one of my favorite characters, which we'll talk about. She has a song by the name of Hell No, which is a great song. It is great into the plot. It really represents this version of the character. And then later on, we have Celie. She has her really big moment. I want to say the name of the song is I'm Beautiful and I'm Here. It is heartbreaking. It is her moment, and she truly captures that moment for the character. So again, the musical aspects, not being a big musical fan, really worked for me, and those two songs were incredible. Now, speaking of incredible, the performances that we have in this film, it is a truly great ensemble cast. Whether we're talking about Halle Bailey, who has a limited screen time as Nettie, but she really captures the love of the sisters that they have for one another very early on in the story, and you feel that love throughout this narrative. You have Hawkins, who plays Harpo. He left a really big impression on me because he's much different than the 1985 version of the character. He has more layers to him. He's a little bit more warmth to him as well. But also, speaking of Corey Hawkins, pairing him with Squeak, who's played by H.E.R, who I know of H.E.R's music, but I've really never seen her. Like, I've never watched her music video, so I didn't know what she looked like. She was pretty good. She, again, limited screen time, but she made the most out of her screen time. So I really like their pairings. You also have one of my favorites, one of the most talented people working today by Colman Domingo, who's having a hell of a year so far with earlier this year on Netflix, Rustin. Great film. Check out my review on that movie. Phenomenal in that film, but he's also just as phenomenal in this film as he plays Albert, aka Mr. He really has a different take on this character. You really get to see a more refined version of this very abusive man-child of a character, and depending on the individual that takes in the story, you can see the somewhat redemption arc, and I believed it by the way Colman plays the character. As Albert, the character has a lot of needs and wants, just like the other characters in this movie, but like them, he can't get them, and the way he decides to get them is using his abusive tactics to hurt others, like Celie, and this is a more human side of the character that I really appreciate that Colman Domingo brought to this role. Now, all that being said, we got to talk about the standouts for me. Number one is talking about Fantasia, who plays the lead character and one of the most tragic characters on screen. She is so great in this role, and if you all don't know, she actually played the character on stage for many years, which makes a lot of sense now, and you can see that, you can feel that in her performance, because it almost feels like it's second nature to her, what she brings to this character to life. When you see the growth from the beginning of the movie all the way to the end of the story, you really believe it, you really feel it. She brings so much to the role. Her vocal performance is phenomenal as well, and seriously, she had some huge shoes to fill on the film adaptation, because Whoopi Goldberg as the character was just phenomenal. I'll be honest, I personally preferred Whoopi's performance over Fantasia, but again, they're two different things they're going for in the character. The essence of the character, foundationally speaking, is still there in Fantasia's performance, but it's much different than what we got with Whoopi. But nonetheless, Fantasia was incredible. I really enjoyed the growth again of seeing what she brought to the role, and I thought that she brought again a different approach, an approach that I can really appreciate. But speaking of appreciation, now for me, Sophia was my favorite character in the 1985 version. The character played beautifully by Oprah Winfrey. And when it comes to this version of the character, played beautifully by Danielle Brooks, she was phenomenal. Like, she is really stealing this film and really captures the character's strength and, more importantly, the personality so well. She's one of the most important characters to Celie's journey, as she looked up to her, even though she was younger than her. But seeing this version of character is a bit different than Oprah, a lot different, being honest. For example, I mentioned how I love that Hell No song. This is a more no-nonsensical version of the character, especially when it comes to the relationship she has with Harpo. So Danielle Brooks, phenomenal jam. Fantasia, Colman Domingo, the whole crew really brought their A-game. I have an actor and a character that didn't really work for me that I'll talk about a little bit later, but collectively speaking, this cast really brought their A-game. Now, something that's very important to the story are the themes, and I found the themes to really still stand strong in this musical version of the story, which I was afraid that it might have been watered down or had less of an impact, because sometimes for me, musicals can take away the seriousness or the groundedness to the actual story at hand, but for the most part, I was never taken out of the story by the musical elements. And again, those themes that I was speaking of strength and not allowing your past or your circumstances to define who you are, finding your inner self and believing yourself and having resilient, seeing beautiful friendships of Black women standing up for one another and supporting one another, and of course forgiveness really still stands strong in this narrative. And tonally speaking, they find the joy. It's not as harsh or as traumatic as the 1985 version, but again, I still appreciate the different approach to the story. But with all that being said, I still have my criticisms. Now, I mentioned I grew up to really appreciate the 1985 version I grew up on. And this film, again, I know it's based on a book and it's also based on a musical, but there are moments that this version of the film is paying homage or more or less trying to recreate those moments from the 1985 version of the movie. And if I'm being honest, they felt more like Easter eggs in this version of the film versus actually playing a part in the actual story at hand. For example, I think of how important the Danny Glover's mailbox, Mr.'s mailbox was to him, and how it played into the story. The mailbox and obviously the story that comes with that and the sisters and the letters and all that stuff is still important in this story, but it wasn't as impactful. It wasn't as important to the story as it was to the 1985 version, which I wish was a little bit more focused there. But also two more examples of like recreating those iconic moments, but not hitting the emotional landing for me. I think of the shaving moment when we see Celie shaving Mr. after he did something to her and she's kind of came to her end of this abusive relationship. That moment in this version really didn't play that well for me, but also the dinner table scene, which I like what they do in this version. It's very much similar, almost shot for shot in a sense of the 85 version, but it still missed the emotional gravitas that I was looking for. Like performance Fantasia, she really comes at him, and you all know, if you've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about in the dinner scene. But again, it's just moments like that that just didn't really hit or execute the emotional satisfaction that I wanted from when I saw that 1985 version of those iconic scenes. One of the best characters to me and one of my favorite characters of the story is we have Shug Avery. She's such an important character to the story, and she's just such a lively character. This time around, we have the incredible Taraji, who I'm a big fan of, and it's nothing against her performance. It's more so how the character was written that didn't really entirely work for me in this version of the film. Again, the performance is fine, but I feel like the character didn't have the same essence. It was kind of missing something, more or less speaking to her personal story. Her relationship with her father and her losing herself to fame and alcohol didn't seem as prominent to this version of the character. She really didn't have the same arc for me. And even though, again, I can appreciate the nuance and also the friendship that she develops with Celie, but overall speaking, again, the arc didn't really entirely work for me in that particular role, which again, I'm such a big fan of that character, and it didn't really entirely work for me. And there's also like little, again, I'm not trying to compare it too much to the film, but I'm going to get into my main criticism with this individual story. But just a little nitpick, again, if you have seen the 1985 version, again, a great film. There are other several examples of, like, I think of Celie and her relationship with Harpo and the other kids that Albert had. Like, Harpo obviously is a big figure in this story, but her relationship with the kids are not even like addressed in this version of the film. I also think of, I mentioned Sophia, she has a lot of great moments, and if you all know the moment when she meets, I believe her name was Miss Millie, and that character is in this version, but how their story kind of collides doesn't really hit home. Like, we have the whole, she goes, I'm not trying to spoil anything for those that are not familiar with any of the story, but she has a jail moment, but then the aftermath of that is not in this version, because again, that's an important part of that character, especially when it comes to the race that was going on with Miss Millie, her wanting her to be her maid, and when she gets out of, you know, her situation, like that was important to Sophia's like arc and her character, and it's very much absent in this version of the film. So little examples like that, like again, not trying to compare it so heavily to that 1985 version, but those are just moments that I thought were important to the character that was very much absent in this version of the film. Now, getting to putting all my fandom aside and speaking to this film, I did find the narrative to be pretty rushed at times, despite the powerful themes. Like, there, again, are some important character development moments that need to be addressed more, that should have been spread out more thoroughly throughout the story, that was missing to me. I personally found the film to really find its footing on a more deeper level once we get past the first 45 minutes, which I found to be a bit unbalanced and inconsistent with its plot, and I thought the musical numbers weren't as complementary to the plot as it is later in the film. Like, the transitions to me in the story into the songs wasn't as good to me as it is a little bit later, and also a couple of those songs in the first half aren't as cohesive, and they kind of come out of nowhere, and they really don't add that much to the story at hand. And last thing I'll mention is the ending of the film, which I like from a build-up and a character perspective, but then not giving too much away. I believe it's public knowledge, and obviously it'll be public once the film comes out, but H.E.R, the artist, the singer H.E.R, who I'm a fan of her music, she's in this film. I won't say who she's playing again. You can look it up to find out if you really want to know, but she plays a very important character that appears later on in the movie. And again, the moment work, the character, the Fantasia performance, all that stuff worked, but who H.E.R plays fell so flat for me. Like, she felt like she was stuck out like a sore thumb. She was miscast in the role. And listen, I get it. Unfortunately, that character that she plays only pops up at that moment, so you don't have the moments to spend with her and really get to know her and see the nuance and the performance. But when she pops up vocally, she brings her A game. Of course, we know she could sing, but her performance really took me out of the scene. Like, I saw H.E.R and not the character, and again, it took me out of the moment, which is unfortunate. Again, the moment still worked, but her presence in the scene took me out of the nuance of the emotional moment for those particular characters that are all involved. So those are my main pros, my nitpicks of being a fan of the original, but also breaking down what I didn't like about this version of the story. So before I give you all my overall thoughts, my score, and let you know if it's worth checking out, if you stuck around to this point of the video, I want to take this moment to thank you all. If you haven't already, consider hitting the like button, sharing your thoughts on the film, and also consider sharing this video to anyone and everyone you know that might want to see this film, but also consider subscribing to the channel. Overall, The Color Purple features a stellar ensemble cast, including Danielle Brooks, who was fantastic as a standout. There's some really great direction, some exceptional musical numbers, and despite me having some issues with the moments feeling rushed to the narrative, this story and its themes of strength, hope, support, friendship, and forgiveness really shines through in this film. This can be a very uplifting crowd pleaser filled with joy and excitement, and it's perfect for this holiday season. I'm going to give this 2023 version of The Color Purple a 4 out of 5. Now, I personally still enjoyed the original film just a little bit more, but I can still appreciate this musical version and what it brings to the table. It's not as depressing or as harsh as the original, but still there are inspiring moments and uplifting moments in so many different ways. So very much satisfied with this version. So that's my thoughts on this 2023 musical version of The Color Purple. Let me know yours in the comments below. What worked, what didn't work, favorite musical number, what characters maybe didn't hit the landing for you if you were a fan of the 1985 version like I am. So let's have all those conversations in the comments below. Thank you all for watching today's review. If you want to stick around and check out more of my content, hit this button, subscribe. Check out all my award contender reviews that I've done lately. Check out my most recent review, and I'll catch you all on the next video.